In February 1897, a legal dispute erupted between the churches of Dima Georgis and Martula Mariam located in the northwestern Ethiopian province of Gojam. The dispute concerned precedence and rank, ecclesiastical office, and the rights of entering the royal court and banquet halls first on state and public events such as banquets and commemorative feasts. The clergy of churches regarded to be the oldest were entitled, by reason of their antiquity and custom, to enter the royal court and commemorative feasts held at the houses of kings and princes. Within Gojam, Dima, founded in early 15th century, held and enjoyed such rights and privileges in peace until 1897, when Martula Mariam's clergy petitioned to have the rights of precedency be given to them, claiming that their church was the oldest in the province. Martula Mariam dated from the late 15th century, but in trying to prove that their monastery antedated their rivals, its clergy spuriously regressed the date of its foundation to the 4th century CE and appropriated the mythical twin kings Abriha and Asbiha as founders. Dima rejected Martula Mariam's case as false and argued, correctly, an older foundation than their rivals. The dispute was aired at a judicial hearing overseen by Emperor Menelik II and his noblemen at the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa. After reviewing the evidence presented to them and hearing the arguments of the litigants, Menelik II, together with his noblemen who were present at the court, brokered a negotiated settlement between the disputing churches. The clergy of Dima dropped their challenge to Martula Mariam's claim of ancient origin and accepted its antiquity, but Dima was left intact with all the privileges it had traditionally enjoyed. Martula Mariam, in turn, was to be satisfied with its newly recognized primacy and elevated ecclesiastical status and agreed to give up its claims to all of the disputed privileges and rights. The story of the dispute and its resolution unfolds within the pages of 2 letters written from Emperor Menelik II to King Takla Haymanot of Gojam. One currently held in the churches of Dabra Marcos and Martula Mariam, the letters are practically unknown to scholars of Ethiopia. The account of the dispute in these letters stands out from other dispute records in Ethiopian church collections. So far as I am aware, it is the first recorded case over the issue of deference and decorum involving Ethiopian church dignitaries. Perhaps more importantly, the case is the first known instance of the use of a hagiographic writing, or saintly biography, in court to defend ecclesiastical seniority and allied privileges and rights. Martula Mariam successfully deployed a Gadol hagiography dedicated to the mythical twin royal saints Abriha and Asbiha to put forward a claim for precedency. The Gadol is a complete fabrication prepared to strengthen its case before the judicial assembly that oversaw the case. To the record, the case engendered is significant on several levels. It illuminates how powerful a tool writing was to those who wielded it to impact legal decisions and defend and legitimize social and economic rights and privileges in 19th century Ethiopia. In particular, the case offers us an insight into how hagiographic writing could be used to readapt and reposition the past to meet the social and economic needs of the present and future. The dispute records can also be mined for information concerning the cultural and religious mindset that shaped the understanding of forgery in the period. It is therefore fitting to reconsider Ethiopia's textual practice, especially the writing of hagiographic texts, and the administrative and legal function of written texts in 19th century Ethiopia in light of the court case under investigation. In this study, I revisit the question of the role of both literary and non-literary texts for legal and administrative purposes. I first begin, then, by analyzing in depth the arguments of Dima and Martula Mariam over precedency and the evidence used by the authorities arbitrating the case. In so doing, I concentrate first on the transmission, preservation, and administrative and legal function of the 2 letters and verdicts originating from Menelik II's court, which record the action of the judicial assembly and the terms of settlement it arranged between the litigants. Thereafter, I shall examine how authentic texts were verified and recognized to be authentic in the period by analyzing the Judicial Council's handling of the hagiographic work Martula Mariam presented to support its case. The analysis will unravel the forgery that allowed credibility to Martula Mariam's antique origin. In all this, I seek to establish that the narrative in hagiographic texts could serve current and future administrative and legal purposes by being used as evidence in court to defend social and economic rights and privileges. The study will conclude with a brief comment on a topic that demands further research: the origin of the Gadla Abriha Wasbiha and development of Martula Maryam's origin myth. In order to do this, I will examine the various extant texts of the Gadla available to me. I argue that it was the need to defend Martula Maryam's prestige that prompted developments that led to the birth of the myth and the writing of the supporting Gadl. The history of Martula Maryam has been studied by many historians and non-historian alike during the last 2 centuries. 3. Because this background is so important for understanding the dispute between Dima and Martula Maryam in the 19th century, an overview of the early phases of their history is presented here. Christianity was introduced into Ethiopia in the 4th century CE, yet it was not until the 14th century that it spread into the region of Gojam. The 15th century in particular had witnessed a flurry of monastic foundations in Gojam, of which Dima and Martula Maryam were notable examples. Credible historical sources concerning Dima's history reach back to the 15th century. The church credits a saint called Takasta Burhan as its founder, a monk who lived in the late 14th century. 4. In the case of Martula Maryam, its founder was Queen Eleni d. 1522, widow of King Zara Yaakov, 1434-1468, and a luminous figure in late medieval Ethiopian history. The exact date of Martula Maryam's foundation is obscure. Contemporary accounts show that the church was firmly established by the early 16th century. 5. For several centuries after her death in 1522, Eleni was celebrated by her church for the purity of her soul and piety, her exemplary Christian life and character, and the generosity of her benefaction. In a devotional text dedicated to eulogizing her life and achievement found at Martula Maryam, Eleni is extolled as the House of Holiness, the Queen of Kings, and the equal of the eminent historical figure Saint Helena in moral worth and achievement. Later in the 19th century, however, Martula Maryam radically rewrote its history and claimed the mythical twin kings of Abriha and Asbiha as its founders. This origin myth struck hard at the heart of the long-held traditions about and feeling of gratitude owed to Queen Eleni. Long recognized by Martula Maryam to be its patron and founder, the church disowned Eleni, who is now hardly remembered. The origin and context of the church's origin myth deserves a detailed examination in a separate study. Here suffice to say that at the root of the myth was the great rivalry between Dima and Martula Maryam over precedence. As noted in the beginning, in the late 19th century, Martula Maryam claimed ancient origin and the rights of precedency for itself, thereby challenging Dima's position as a senior church in Gojam. Naturally, Dima strongly and persistently rejected Martula Maryam's claim throughout the late 19th century. Dima had a venerable past and hagiographical materials to back it up and defend its claim for seniority. Contrary to Dima, Martula Maryam lacked a credible ancient past and written material to support it, which proved to be a serious deficiency in its quest for preeminence. But if Martula Maryam's ancient origin was questionable for lack of written evidence, then it was only natural that the church remedied the gaps in its records by means of forgery. Martula Maryam's origin myth and the writing of the hagiography of Abriha and Asbiha in the 1890s must therefore be understood in this context. Dima and Martula Maryam appear to have been engaged in a heated debate over the issue of precedency throughout the last half of the 19th century. The Gojame historian Takla Iyasis, writing in the early 20th century, tells us that such dispute broke out between the clergy of the two churches over order of precedence during the celebration of Dajak Tadla's commemorative feast at Bichana in the mid-1860s. 7. Finally, the question of Martula Maryam's antiquity was brought into dramatic focus in 1897, when a royal court presided over by Emperor Menelik II heard the case. After reviewing the evidence presented to them and hearing the argument of the disputants, Menelik II and his courtiers arranged a negotiated settlement between the two parties. A summary of the Judicial Assembly's judgment and the terms of the dispute settlement are given in Menelik II's letters addressed to King Takla Haymanot of Gojam. Both letters are the official record of the same proceedings and deserve to be quoted and published in their entirety. The Lion of the tribe of Judah hath prevailed. Menelik II, elect of God, King of Kings of Ethiopia. May it reach King Takla Haymanot, follower of the true faith, son of Saint Mark the Evangelist. How are you, really, my brother? I, thank God, am well. I brought the clergy of Dima face to face with the clergy of Martula Mariam and resolved their court case. Herewith are their respective arguments. Having dropped their challenge to Martula Mariam's claim of ancient foundation by Abriha and Asbiha, the Dima clergy then accepted their Martula Mariam's foundation by Abriha and Asbiha. They said to them, even if you were the first to be founded, Sumit, 9 Baraki 10, the saying of benediction, the right to enter the royal court first, to partake in state ceremonials and memorial banquets belong to us. We have never lost possession of these rights previously. The clergy of Martula Mariam replied to them, if you acknowledge our church's foundation by Abriha and Asbiha, then you must entirely relinquish to us the right to enter the royal court first and Baraki. They judged one another in these terms over the case. However, the judgment rendered according to Thephatha Nagast and the vote of the nobility Makwanant is that, although Martula Mariam was the first to enter the royal court first to partake in state ceremonials and memorial banquets belong to us. We have never lost possession of these rights previously. The clergy of Martula Mariam replied to them, if you acknowledge our church's foundation by Abriha and Asbiha, then you must entirely relinquish to us the right to enter the royal court first and Baraki. They judged one another in these terms over the case. However, the judgment rendered according to Thephatha Nagast and the vote of the nobility Makwanant is that, although Martula Mariam was the first to be founded, if the rights to enter the royal court first and the saying of benediction have been hitherto in the possession of Dima, let them, the clergy of Dima, win the case. This is the term by which we arbitrated the disputants and concluded the case. Since the clergy of Martula Mariam have said that there are records in church collections within Gojam which assert that Martula Mariam was not founded by Abriha and Asbiha, let such writing in churches be deleted. Since the rights of saying benediction and entering the royal court first were in the hands of Dima, let them be confirmed to hold them as before. Let them not violate this decision. This was sent by Menelik II, and copied and authenticated by seal on the 27th day of Sanay at the town of Dobra Marcos 1889 year of mercy the 4th of July 1897 with the permission of King Takla Haymanot. The seal brought from Menelik is found in Dima Georgis. The Lion of the tribe of Judah hath prevailed. Menelik II, elect of God, King of kings of Ethiopia. May it reach King Takla Haymanot, follower of the true faith, son of Saint Mark the Evangelist. How have you been, my brother? I, thank God, am well. In the dispute between Martula Mariam and Dima Georgis over precedency, when they the Martula Mariam clergy said that, you let us use the evidence of a recently copied manuscript lit. Motherless new book, and lose the case, we said to them, a newly copied manuscript cannot be adduced as evidence. Lately an ancient manuscript of Gadla Abriha and Aspaha has been found in Tegar, and when we all inspected it, it substantiated the claims of the Martula Mariam clergy. Since the clergy of Martula Mariam have won the case with the evidence of the book, please deal with the matter of their precedency as you see fit. Written in the city of Addis Ababa on Ter 28. 1889 year of mercy the 5th of February 1897. Although both were written by one person and addressed to a single recipient, the letters were preserved at different institutions. One of the letters is preserved in the Church of Dobra Marcos in Gojam, a major foundation of Takla Haymanot. The manuscript into which it is copied is Tariqa Nagast. It was copied into this manuscript on the 4th of July 1897 with the permission of King Takla Haymanot and authenticated by Menelik II's seal. The one at Dobra Marcos is evidently a copy of the original retained by Dima. The existence of Menelik II's original letter at Dima is alluded to in the copy at Dobra Marcos. It is possible that the letter is still kept at Dima. For the purpose of clarity, I have designated it letter 1. Menelik II's other letter, which is precisely dated to the 5th of February 1897, is preserved in Martula Mariam's collection. The letter is encased in a glass frame and is the first object that greets the visitor to the treasury store of the church. I have designated it letter 2. Letter 2 has all the appearance of an original sent to Takla Haymanot. If a letter is found in the recipient's church or court, or even any institution that was not intended to be its destination, we generally assume that it is the original letter. This is because in 19th century Ethiopia copies were not often made before the originals were dispatched. This conclusion is true in the great majority of cases. 12. From this we might reasonably conclude that the letters found in Martulamarium and Dima but addressed to Takla Haymanot are originals of letters dispatched from Menelik II. Before the original made its way into Martulamarium's collection, it is very likely that letter 2 was presented to Takla Haymanot and a copy was made of it at Dobra Markos. A searching scrutiny of the manuscript collection of Dobra Markos Church might yield a copy of this letter. At this point, however, we are not in a position to compare the copy with its original, since we have only one or the other. It should be borne in the reader's mind that the 4th of July 1897 refers to the date on which letter 1 was copied into the Dobra Markos manuscript. Unless conclusive evidence to the contrary is found, I suggest that both letters were written at the same time soon after the conclusion of the court hearing sometime in late January or early February 1897, but reached their intended destinations at different times. The above letters follow the formulaic epistolary pattern of Menelik II's letters, opening with the usual royal title of "The Lion of the Tribe of Judah hath prevailed." Takla Haymanot's royal title of "Follower of the True Faith, Son of Saint Mark the Evangelist" is also found in both letters. This expression occurs in the correspondence exchanged between Takla Haymanot and other people during this period. 13. Its appearance in the letters above indicates Menelik II's or his secretary's familiarity with it. The letters also contain words of greeting similar to those which commonly started letters addressed from one person to another in 19th century Ethiopia. One typical letter opens as follow: "May this letter sent by Blada Gebra Messi reach my Lord Michel Mikhail. How have you been? Have you been well?" 14. In letter 1 above, this formulaic way of expressing greeting, Ejigan Ende Allah, lit. "How are you?" really appears. This phrase conveys feeling of effusive affection and esteem and heartfelt concern for the health and well-being of an addressee during this period. The letters provide us with some interesting insights into the relationship between Menelik II and Takla Haymanot. Menelik II used the familial terminology of "my brother" in addressing Takla Haymanot. Such terminology of family relationships rarely occurs in the exchanges between emperors and regional kings. Instead, terminologies that convey unequal relations, lordship and subordination, tended to be used in exchanges between central and regional powers. 15. Surely this familial notion presenting Menelik II as brother was not applied in the exchanges of letters between the emperor and provincial princes. Brotherhood in the sense used in our letters implied not only parity of social status, but also the existence of close friendship, cooperation, and personal links between the two persons. The use of the terminology, "my brother," was an indication of the respect the emperor had toward the Gojame king, a symbol of social parity and royal brotherhood. To Menelik II, Takla Haymanot was not just a mere regional king but his peer as well. The letters under review are official records of the judicial verdicts and dispute settlements between the parties to the case brokered by Menelik II and his courtiers. It is in letter 1 that the fundamental issues underlying the case are clearly brought into view. Letter 1 assumes that it was the clergy of Martulamarium who initiated the petition and presents the church as the party whose rights were injured. While both letters present a finished case, letter 1 includes a list of charges and the argument of both sides. Martulamarium argued that the rights of entering the royal court first on state occasions and for partaking in the commemorative banquet belonged to them. The right of giving blessing and benediction during these occasions, they argued, likewise rightly belonged to them. The basis for Martulamarium's claim to these rights and privileges was the antiquity of its foundation in the 4th century CE by the twin royal saints Abriha and Asbiha. The argument of Martulamarium was that Dima was not sufficiently antique. They charged their opponents with having benefited from and infringed on privileges which were rightly Martulamarium's. Letter 1 then begins by describing what the clergy of Dima said in the meeting in reply to the charges. Dima at first appeared to have rejected Martulamarium's claim of foundation by Abriha and Asbiha as implausible and denied all the charges leveled against it. The dispute ended in reconciliation. Our letter describes the settlement of the dispute as a compromise negotiated by the two disputing parties with the mediation of Menelik II and his noblemen. The judicial assembly convinced Dima to drop its challenge to Martulamarium's foundation by Abriha and Asbiha. Martula Merriam also prompted Menelik II to include instruction in his letter to Takla Haymanot to see to it that all records in the collection of the churches of Gojam that contradicted their invented history be destroyed. Nevertheless, the judges prevented Martula Merriam from extending their grasp over the disputed rights and privileges. Despite the acknowledgement of Martula Merriam's antiquity, the court judged that Dima ought to be confirmed with the traditional rights. This is undoubtedly a Dima victory. The letter records the means by which Dima's victory had been won, the vote of the noblemen and the evidence of the law book called Fathanagast. 16 Dima based its claim to the rights and privileges under dispute on the sanction of long-standing customs and usage which had existed in the collective memory, time out of mind. Obviously this claim had strong merit to convince the royal judges to confirm Dima with the traditional rights. Martula Merriam was compelled to acquiesce in these arrangements and withdrew its claim to the disputed rights. By agreeing to accept the compromise, Martula Merriam closed the door for another attempt to claim the rights later. The decision of the court was therefore demonstrably pro-Dima. Contrary to Letter 1, Letter 2 clearly presents a different outcome that worked more to Martula Merriam's benefit. As in Letter 1, Letter 2 states that the dispute was aired before the same court, but the charges leveled against Dima are not identical. Letter 1 shows Martula Merriam trying to use its invented past to unsuccessfully claim seniority over Dima and the associated rights and privileges. However, Letter 2 represents the Church as petitioning Emperor Menelik II only to assert its precedency over Dima without mentioning the associated rights and privileges that were under dispute. The letter records that the Judicial Assembly confirmed the precedency of Martula Merriam over Dima. The acceptance of Martula Merriam's antiquity established the Church's moral victory and validated the truth and justice of its case. Furthermore, Letter 2 presents an old hagiographic text brought to the court from a church in Tigray as the key to the settlement, but, unlike Letter 1, it makes no mention of the use of the Fathanagast by the Judicial Assembly to reach its decision. In Letter 1 Martula Merriam is represented as giving up all their claim to all of the disputed rights and privileges. Although they are the reasons Martula Merriam petitioned the emperor in the first place, the disputed rights and privileges are nowhere to be found in Letter 2. While Letter 1 presents the dispute as a negotiation brokered by Menelik II and his courtiers, there is no account in Letter 2 of the compromise Martula Merriam reached with its opponent. In this way, Letter 2 casts the outcome of the court hearing as a clear Martula Merriam victory. My analysis above leaves out the question of why Emperor Menelik II had two letters written for recording the same dispute aired at the same court and sent to the same recipient. Dispute records over the issue of decorum and protocol are uncommon in Ethiopian documentary tradition. Still less common in the Ethiopian church collection are records written by a single individual describing a single dispute from very different perspectives. Although both letters are addressed to Takla Haymanot and record the same court hearing, the letters represent significantly different descriptions and outcome of the dispute between Dima and Martula Merriam. In Letter 1 the outcome of the hearing appears as a clear Dima victory, whereas Letter 2 portrays the court's decision as favorable to Martula Merriam alone. There is no obvious explanation for this. The most straightforward explanation is that the emperor and the Judicial Assembly did not want to appear to particularly favor one church over the other. But their decision undoubtedly worked to the benefit of Dima. Both letters depict Martula Merriam as the party whose right is injured. Yet Dima was left intact with all the privileges it had traditionally enjoyed. In writing double records of the dispute settlement and verdict in line with the interest of each party to the case, the Judicial Assembly tried to appear neutral. From the foregoing it is clear that records of the court case under review bear the characteristics of three genres: letters, judicial verdicts, and dispute settlements. These documents were also more than just records of the events of the hearing at the court of Menelik II. My conviction is that the letters and verdicts were meant not only to serve as a memorial to the event, but also to stand for all time and serve future administrative purposes. Consequently, they merit the term administrative and legal documents. As is standard for legal documents, they are authenticated by royal seal. Furthermore, similar to legal texts, the letters and verdicts are structured so as to put into effect the prohibitions, limitations, and rights sanctioned by the Judicial Assembly. For instance, letter 1 ends with the injunction, let the parties to the dispute settlement not violate this decision. Martula Mariam is represented as giving up all their claim to all of the disputed rights and privileges. Although they are the reasons Martula Mariam petitioned the emperor in the first place, the disputed rights and privileges are nowhere to be found in letter 2. While letter 1 presents the dispute as a negotiation brokered by Menelik II and his courtiers, there is no account in letter 2 of the compromise Martula Mariam reached with its opponent. In this way, letter 2 casts the outcome of the court hearing as a clear Martula Mariam victory. My analysis above leaves out the question of why Emperor Menelik II had 2 letters written for recording the same dispute aired at the same court and sent to the same recipient. Dispute records over the issue of decorum and protocol are uncommon in Ethiopian documentary tradition. Still less common in the Ethiopian church collection are records written by a single individual describing a single dispute from very different perspectives. Although both letters are addressed to Takla Haymanot and record the same court hearing, the letters represent significantly different descriptions and outcome of the dispute between Dima and Martula Mariam. In letter 1 the outcome of the hearing appears as a clear Dima victory, whereas letter 2 portrays the court's decision as favorable to Martula Mariam alone. There is no obvious explanation for this. The most straightforward explanation is that the emperor and the judicial assembly did not want to appear to particularly favor one church over the other. But their decision undoubtedly worked to the benefit of Dima. Both letters depict Martula Mariam as the party whose right is injured. Yet Dima was left intact with all the privileges it had traditionally enjoyed. In writing double records of the dispute settlement and verdict in line with the interest of each party to the case, the judicial assembly tried to appear neutral. From the foregoing it is clear that records of the court case under review bear the characteristics of 3 genres: letters, judicial verdicts, and dispute settlements. These documents were also more than just records of the events of the hearing at the court of Menelik II. My conviction is that the letters and verdicts were meant not only to serve as a memorial to the event, but also to stand for all time and serve future administrative purposes. Consequently, they merit the term administrative and legal documents. As is standard for legal documents, they are authenticated by royal seal. Furthermore, similar to legal texts, the letters and verdicts are structured so as to put into effect the prohibitions, limitations, and rights sanctioned by the judicial assembly. For instance, letter 1 ends with the injunction, let the parties to the dispute settlement not violate this decision. The letters are crafted so as to remove the basis for future dispute between the parties to the case. The manner of their preservation points to the same conclusion. The letters were stored in appropriate archives for future possible reference. The letter and verdict at Martula Mariam is encased in a shining glass frame and prominently displayed at the main entrance of the church's treasure store and collection. It still serves as a tool to provide the church with memories of its disputes and legal victory over its opponent and the means by which it had been won. The accounts of disputes with Dima could provide Martula Mariam with useful and readily available arguments that could be used against any potential challengers in the future. Securing Martula Mariam's status as a senior church in Gojam in future therefore depended on the permanent preservation of the letter. This explains why the church carefully preserved the verdict of the royal court presided over by Menelik II. In the next section, I examine the process involved in reaching the decision concerning Martula Mariam's antiquity by Menelik II and his noblemen. In their award of the case over precedency to Martula Mariam and the privileges and rights associated with precedency to Dima, the arbiters had consulted the legal code called Fathanagast, as letter 1 indicates. As recorded in letter 2, however, the chief point of reference and the basis of their judgment of precedency was Gadla Abriha Wasbiha, which was presented by Martula Mariam as evidence for the court hearing. The hagiography offered proof of Martula Mariam's ancient foundation and therefore seniority over its rival. It gives substance to the church's foundation myth, as in the following: they, Abriha and Asbiha, crossed the Gihon River, Blue Nile, and came to the land of Gojam. They gathered the people and the witches and instructed them to bring out their idols before them. The idols fell from their throne and shattered into pieces like silver when they were brought before Abriha and Asbiha. The witches and idolaters trembled in fear when they saw this great miracle and said, "Oh, chosen kings, please do the right thing for us and convert us to the Orthodox faith." They were all baptized and became believers in a day, and the sacred mystery was revealed to them. They sent them to their homes with joy and in peace. After this, Abriha and Asbiha wanted to build a temple, and they built a splendid structure and made its pillars from gold and silver. They settled priests and deacons and established all its rules and appointed Theresa Riasan, head of heads, as leader of the clergy. They named this temple Martula Mariam. Martula Mariam's case rested primarily on the evidence of the passage quoted above. It describes how the royal saints arrived from Semen to Amhara, and from there they came to Gojam across the Gihon River, and then to the Martula Mariam area. There they destroyed idols, converted the idol worshippers of the area to the Christian faith, built a church adorned with gold and silver and dedicated it to Saint Mary, named the church Martula Mariam, and appointed a leader for the church called Reasariusan. The exact details of Dima's argument presented to the Judicial Assembly is not recorded to us. Both the clergy of Dima and the royal councillors did not, it appears, dispute the existence of the royal saints. Nor did they seem to have denounced Gadla Abriha Waspaha as a forgery in its entirety. But the clergy of Dima appear to have criticized the copy of the Gadal at Martula Mariam as comparatively recent and unreliable for use in legal proceedings. They suspected that their rivals might have interpolated fabricated stories to prove their claim. What Dima challenged was therefore only the parts of the text of the Gadal concerning Martula Mariam. The evidence of letter 2 shows that Menelik II and his courtiers took Dima's allegation of forgery seriously. When the case came to be heard in 1897, they hesitated to accept Martula Mariam's account of ancient heritage fully because the church lacked authentic hagiography. The court was presented first with a recent copy of the Gadal, which Menelik II and his royal councillors found suspect and refused to admit it as evidence. According to letter 2, the royal judges refused the evidence of the Gadal, on the grounds of its recent origin. It appears that Menelik II, seeking a resolution of the dispute, perhaps sent for the original of the Gadal in Tigray. On this occasion the oldest, extant manuscript from an unidentified church in Tigray was found. It was this Gadal that was presented to the court. The records of the court decision make many assumptions about the origins and place of composition of the oldest extant Gadal and do not give an account of the exhibition and inspection of this supposedly ancient manuscript, beyond reference to, when we all inspected it, it substantiated the claims of Martula Mariam. 18 But it is clear that it sufficiently satisfied the emperor and his councillors, and it was admitted as evidence in the legal proceeding. Menelik II and his courtiers declared the original to be genuine and decided in favor of Martula Mariam. First criticized as inauthentic or suspect, the narrative of the hagiography of the royal saints then became accepted as credible. This paradox between a non-existent past backed by a forged text and legal victory, and an actual past and legal defeat raises questions. What made the narrative of the Gadal, which asserts something that never in reality happened, credible? What was the methodology used to establish the authenticity of hagiographic texts? Despite its long history of literacy and documentary tradition, Ethiopia had not established any national standards for record appraisal, description, preservation, and access until very recently. There was no prescribed law against forgery in 19th century Ethiopia to understand the method by which forged texts were recognized. The treatment of the copy of Gadla Abriha Wasbiha first as suspect and then the acceptance of the original and the oldest extant manuscript as genuine shed light on the mode by which genuine texts were distinguished from forgeries and the process used to verify the authenticity of texts. It is worth noting that originality was important, as the Emperor's Council equated originality and old age with truth and authenticity. The royal judges rejected the recent copy of the Gadal as evidence but accepted an original and older manuscript in Tigray, thereby contrasting originality with forgery. In the eyes of the royal council, older manuscripts carried more value than comparatively recent ones. The assumption of royal judges was that, unlike recent copies, older manuscripts in their original form could not be manipulated or falsified. Therefore, the principal agreed methodology of distinguishing forgeries from genuine texts was establishing the origins of the extant texts. This meant that apparently Menelik II and his noblemen never inspected the Gadal for the credibility of the narrative it enshrines. Thus the case makes it clear that the implausibility of the narrative of hagiographic texts mattered little in 19th century Ethiopia in assessing their value and authenticity. In the final analysis, it was forgery that gave Martula Mariam the pretense of a case and eventually guaranteed its legal victory. The dictionary meaning of forgery is the action of forging or producing a copy of a document, signature, banknote, or work of art. 20a forger produces or fabricates false objects to pass them as genuine. Judged by this criterion, the gattal presented by Martula Mariam to support its case could be designated a forgery. The gattal refers essentially to a virtual or non-existent past. Both the supposed foundation date and the founders of the church were products of the pure imagination of the gattal's writers. 21 without forgery, therefore, the case of Martula Mariam would have been lost. However, this does not, obviously, explain why the church invented its origin myth in the first place and why it expected the gattal it presented as evidence would be accepted by the royal council without doubt. The mere concept of forgery does not do justice to the complexities of the phenomenon under investigation. Forgery in its modern understanding will easily lead to the conclusion that Martula Mariam was intentionally practicing deception in writing the hagiography that ensured its legal victory. Our gattal was far from being a self-consciously fictive text, created with a fraudulent intention. Mythical history closely resonates with and better characterizes the content of a narrative in the gattal. The gattal is written in a way that made its narrative reliable in the eyes of contemporaries. This is accomplished by using the traditional literary techniques used in composing hagiographic texts. The writers of the gattal freely borrowed materials from, and strictly adhered to, the formulaic pattern of classic Ethiopian saintly biography. Its central narrative contains these common elements of similar texts about the life of the royal saints, their parentage, birth and youth, their spiritual struggles and missionary zeal, a kidden or pact between God and the royal saints, and their death and miracles performed before death and posthumously. Information about the parentage and birth of Abriha and Asbiha is contained in formulaic passages describing the circumstances of their birth. They were born by divine will from saintly and royal parentage. Their father was the Aksumite king Tazar and their mother was Sophia, who is referred to as saintly or holy. The bulk of the gattal is dedicated to recording their missionary deeds after ascending the throne. It portrays them as ideal Christian rulers and evangelizers of the whole of Ethiopia. Towards the end, they died at the hands of devil-inspired pagans after a life dedicated to the service of God and became martyrs to their faith. Their saintly virtues included the powerful miracles performed both before their demise and posthumously. Like similar works, the writers of the gattal are primarily motivated by the need to reveal divine truth. The birth of the twin kings, the acts of building churches, the work of Christianization, the miracles they performed, and so on are all presented as having being initiated by divine will. Typical to hagiographic texts, the gattal also deals with faith rather than reason. Hagiographies are devotional writings and their appeal is to emotion and faith. In sum, in methodological orientation, purpose, epistemology, and literary tools, the writers of the gattal followed standard Ethiopian textual practice. It is this formal framework of a hagiographic text followed by the writers of the gattal that invested Martula Mariam's origin myth with the form of undisputed historical fact. In light of this discussion, the acceptance of the gattal by Menelik II and his courtiers as a genuine historical record is hardly astonishing. It now remains to investigate what the records of the dispute can tell us about the origin and making of the hagiography. Understanding the origin and place of composition of the gattal requires us to analyze its content and organization. However, to establish the date of the gattal's writing, one must first of all consider, even if only in a general way, the formation of the cult of the mythical royal saints. I will therefore briefly discuss the formation of the cult of the royal saints because of its relevance for the topic. The cult of the royal saints is acknowledged by the Ethiopian Church at national level, with the saints being honored on Tekemt 4, the 11th of October, every year. 23 Martyrdom was a convenient means through which a person could become a saint of the Ethiopian Church. A martyr who is regarded as a saint is honored by establishing a commemoration day on the day of the saint's martyrdom and birthday. The commemoration date for Abriha and Asbiha has been established on the supposed day of their martyrdom. 24 But I have found no hard evidence of the exact date when the royal saints were officially recognized among the ranks of saints by the Ethiopian Church. Unlike its Catholic counterpart, the Ethiopian Church had no standardized canonization process through which individuals were officially declared to be saints of the Church. Often, popular recognition of the sainthood of a person was enough to have him or her canonized as a saint. The hagiography of Abriha and Asbiha, I argue, provided the chief basis for the development of their cult and acknowledgement as saints at national level. The origin of the cult of Abriha and Asbiha and the hagiography dedicated to them remain shrouded in mystery. No evidence has been uncovered that would allow an assertive statement about the original place or circumstances of the Gatel's writing and the writer or writers of the various redactions. We do not know, either, where and by whom the detail about Martula Mariam was included in the text. Since the evidence so far available is not conclusive, any suggestions about the origins of the cult of the royal saints must be considered only tentative. Paolo Morosini has analyzed and written on the origin of the Gatel, arguing that the cult of the royal saints was known in the 14th century and that their Gatel was composed in the late 14th century during the ministry of Bishop Salama d. 1390 of the Ethiopian Church. 25 However, there is no evidence to back up Morosini's suggestions. The official recognition of the twin kings as saints and popular cults about them took a long time period to be developed. The royal saints were invented whole cloth by the clergy of the Church of Axum, who credit them as founders. While the earliest known notions concerning the twin kings can be traced back to earlier centuries, their Gatel in its present content and form could not have been written earlier than the late 19th century. The saints are already mentioned in some 18th century codices and documents. The documents are two charters allegedly issued for the Church of Axum by the twin kings. The charters have been preserved in a manuscript that was copied for the Scottish scholar James Bruce in 1771, when he was in Ethiopia. However, the original text was possibly produced at an earlier date than 1771. The historian Anais Wion recently argued that the earliest preserved version of the text through which the charters come down to us was copied during the reign of Ieyasu I.R. 1682-1706. At the very least, the text gives evidence of the existence of the cult, if not the saintly status, of the twin brothers already in the second half of 17th century Axum. So far as I am aware, outside Tigray the cult of royal saints existed only at Martula Mariam, where it emerges in written sources about the church towards the end of the 19th century. The earliest mention of the saints is in the Gatel itself. The connection was presented in two redactions of the Gatel of the Saints, both preserved in copies made in the late 19th and 20th centuries. The Gojame Athorlaka Takla Iyasus included Martula Mariam's origin myth in his famous genealogical work written sometime in the late 19th and early 20th century. 27 Did the myth already exist before the writing of the Gatel? There is no evidence in textual sources concerning Martula Mariam whatsoever that indicates its existence prior to the writing of the Gatel. The limited spread of the cult of these two royal saints both within and beyond Tigray points to the relatively recent composition of the Gatel, to which we will return shortly. It is logical to conclude that the royal saints never were well known in Gojam until the 20th century. We might tentatively put the date of development of the cult of Abriha and Asbiha between the 1680s and the earliest surviving Gatel, the late 19th century. Let us now return to the question of when and where the Gatel was originally written. 8 versions of the Gatel of the royal saints which survive at 7 institutions are known to me. The churches of Abriha wa Asbiha, Axum, Asbi, and Takla Haymanot, all located in the province of Tigray, are known to have the Gatel. 2 copies of the Gadler preserved at Martula Mariam. Of the 8 manuscripts currently known to exist, 4 are dated to the late 19th and 20th centuries. The position of the remaining 4 versions of the Gadler not known to me. The oldest of the preserved manuscripts of the Gatel at Martula Mariam is dated to the 1870s. The latest redaction of the hagiography at Martula Mariam, obviously based in the first one, was produced sometime in the first half of the 20th century. 29 The Gatel at the Church of Abriha wa Asbiha in Gamut available to me was copied in 1925, a date which is mentioned explicitly in the text. The manuscript at Axum is dated precisely to 1955, as stated in the text, indicating that it was written later than those of Abriha wa Asbiha and Martula Mariam. 30A copy of the Gattal is also found at Accademia Nazionale dei Lincei. Paolo Morosini's study of the text is based in the copy at this institution. 31 Finally, the existence of a copy of the Gattal at the Institute of Ethiopian Studies at Addis Ababa University is reported. From when, then, does our Gattal date? So far as can be judged by the extant evidence, the general date of the writing of the Gattal can be assigned with greater degrees of certainty not earlier than the late 19th century. The only known versions of the Gattal available to me are those preserved in Martula Mariam and some sections of the text originating from the Church of Abriha wa Asbiha. The discussion in this study is primarily based on the oldest Gattal at Martula Mariam and Morosini's study. As a whole, the Gattal does seem to have a single date for its composition in its current form and content, but it was compiled from a number of sources, both oral and written, some of which were drawn from scriptures and historiographic texts, some of which were local legends developed in the eponymous Church of Abriha wa Asbiha and Axum, and some of which were taken from legends cultivated in Martula Mariam and other areas. 33 The Gattal's writers drew on, more importantly, their pure imagination. There is a great deal that we do not yet understand about the origin and dissemination of the Gattal. We lack any contextualizing information about place and time of composition of the original manuscript. The Gattal is of very poor literary quality. It is written, as whole, carelessly and perhaps in haste, and is excessively repetitive, formulaic, and enigmatic about many important points. The internal organization and the emphasis of the content of the Gattal provide a crucial clue to the place of its composition. With this in mind, it is appropriate to briefly present the content of the text. The introduction of Christianity to Ethiopia and the foundations of the churches of Axum and Abriha wa Asbiha, folios 5R 29R, 33R 46V form the central narrative of the hagiography. 34 The manuscript of the Gattal, folios 2R4V, 79R79V, also contains a selection of the Queen of Sheba's stories emanating from the Kebra Nagast. The destruction of pagan idols, fictional battles and rebellions, and the building of churches and the promotion of Christian religion by the twin kings in the Lake Tana region, 47R 51R Tigray, 51R 53R, Amhara and Gojam, 53R 55V, 59R Area, Jimma, and Shawa 55V 56V occupy some folios of the manuscript. 35 Since Axum and Abriha wa Asbiha are the topic of special interest in the Gattal, the hagiography must have been originally composed by the clergy of one of these churches. I consider the clergy of Abriha wa Asbiha to be the most probable alternative. As the following discussion will show, one may point out that throughout the text the writers focus much more on Abriha wa Asbiha than they do on Axum. There is in fact a conspicuous lack of focus on the later history of the Church of Axum after its foundation. The references to Abriha wa Asbiha are too numerous to cite here, hence I will focus on the two aspects of the relevant information in the Gattal. First, I will present the main characters in the Gattal, the geographical setting, and the narrative spaces within which many of the events represented in the hagiography took place. Then I will present the miracle stories which are attested only in Abriha wa Asbiha. The writers of the Gattal used Gamad and the localities around it in the district of Hazan as a setting for unfolding the plot. References to place names in and around Gamad are plentiful in the Gattal 33R 35V, 50R 53V, 68R 70R. The connection between the royal saints and Gamad was particularly strong. It is notable, for instance, that Sophia, the mother of the twin kings, and her father and the chief priest at the royal court in Axum, Ambaram, are made to be natives of Gamad. Likewise, the 7 named childhood companions of the twin kings are presented as natives of Gamad. These children were brought to the court in Axum from Gamad as pages and grew up at the royal household together with the future twin kings. King Tazar, the father of Abriha and Asbiha, made special arrangements for the support of the 7 children, who would also play a prominent role at the court of the twin kings when they came of age. It is significant that they were baptized by Bishop Salama, the first bishop of the Ethiopian Church in the 4th century, by a special order of Abriha and Asbiha, before any priest from Axum was converted to Christianity. Before their eventual resettlement at Gamad, they served Saint Mary of Zion at Axum as deacons and priests, while others became translators of books from Arabic to Ge'ez. Abriha and Asbiha also confirmed the 7 priests from Gamad with the privileges and rights granted them by King Tazar. 36 It is obvious that the clergy of Abriha wa Asbiha were the source of information on the personal background of the mythical kings. Other references to Gamad sharpen the view that the Gadol originated in Abriha wa Asbiha. Soon after the advent of Christianity in Ethiopia, the twin kings turned their attention to the people of Gamad, who were baptized by Bishop Salama en masse. Then the kings built a church consecrated to Saint Mary. It was this church at Gamad to which they showed special interest that would eventually become their shrine and be named after them. The construction of the church is described with considerable detail. It was chiseled out of solid rock in a rocky area in Gamad with the help of the Holy Spirit. The church was built in the image of the heavenly Jerusalem, and its architecture was without equal with 42 columns, adorned with gold, silver, diamonds, and mirrors. Every part of the church is said to radiate brilliant beams of light and shines like the sun. Abriha and Asbiha brought with them their childhood companions and resettled them at the new church in Gamad, their original homeland. The nephew of the kings, Amhara, was appointed to be the Nebraed or the head of the new church. He was instructed by the twin kings to preserve and enforce the law of the church and administer the lands of Gamad and the adjacent locality of Aba, which were given as fiefs to the 7 priests together. It is also important to take note that Gamad was the final resting place of the royal saints. Shortly before the day of his martyrdom on Tekhemt 4, Abriha prayed earnestly for many things, and God granted him all his requests. Among other items, God promised that Abriha's resting place, the land of Gamad, shall be the most glorious of all places. In addition, God promised that, which literally means, if anyone undertakes a pilgrimage to your holy tomb to pray on the day of your feast, I will pardon him and his descendants up to 10 generations. 38 Abriha was buried at Gamad as he wished, and his brother Asbiha continued to show a keener interest in Abriha wa Asbiha at Gamad than in any other church in the country. He is reported to have created rules and regulations for the church, confirmed Amhara as Nebraed of Abriha wa Asbiha, and instructed the clergy to keep the commemoration feast of his deceased brother. Further, he gave the land of Ad Arbea in Sarah and Sejerata in Geralta for the support of the clergy of Abriha wa Asbiha at Gamad. Towards the end, Asbiha, in turn, prayed for God to grant him his wish to be buried at Abriha wa Asbiha, and he was laid to rest with his brother following his death at the hands of a fictive pagan chief of Jimma. 39 Abriha wa Asbiha remained the special concern of Asbiha's son and successor, Asfa, who gave land to its clergy in Ambasanait and Adwad Sanat and instructed the church's officials to preserve the bones of his royal ancestors and celebrate their commemoration feast on Tekhemt 4. He confirmed the lands granted to the church by the royal saints and had Bishop Salama anathematize and condemn anyone who might violate the property of Abriha wa Asbiha. Asfa made lavish gifts to the church of Abriha wa Asbiha, including 24 silver and gold crowns, 24 gold and silver censers, innumerable pieces of furniture, and scriptures. He also ensured that Abriha wa Asbiha's laws and regulations were, like the heavenly Jerusalem, and the dignity of its priests was as exalted as the priests of heaven. 40:36 The details of the miracles reported in the Gadol also speak in favor of the Abriha wa Asbiha origin of the text. The church was the setting for many miracles performed by the twin kings. And King Tazar, the father of Abriha and Asbiha, made special arrangements for the support of the 7 children, who would also play a prominent role at the court of the twin kings when they came of age. It is significant that they were baptized by Bishop Salama, the first bishop of the Ethiopian Church in the 4th century, by a special order of Abriha and Asbiha, before any priest from Axum was converted to Christianity. Before their eventual resettlement at Gamad, they served Saint Mary of Zion at Axum as deacons and priests, while others became translators of books from Arabic to Ge'ez. Abriha and Asbiha also confirmed the 7 priests from Gamad with the privileges and rights granted them by King Tazar. 36. It is obvious that the clergy of Abriha wa Asbiha were the source of information on the personal background of the mythical kings. Other references to Gamad sharpen the view that the Gadol originated in Abriha wa Asbiha. Soon after the advent of Christianity in Ethiopia, the twin kings turned their attention to the people of Gamad, who were baptized by Bishop Salama en masse. Then the kings built a church consecrated to Saint Mary. It was this church at Gamad to which they showed special interest that would eventually become their shrine and be named after them. The construction of the church is described with considerable detail. It was chiseled out of solid rock in a rocky area in Gamad with the help of the Holy Spirit. The church was built in the image of the heavenly Jerusalem, and its architecture was without equal with 42 columns, adorned with gold, silver, diamonds, and mirrors. Every part of the church is said to radiate brilliant beams of light and shines like the sun. Abriha and Asbiha brought with them their childhood companions and resettled them at the new church in Gamad, their original homeland. The nephew of the kings, Amhara, was appointed to be the Nebraed or the head of the new church. He was instructed by the twin kings to preserve and enforce the law of the church and administer the lands of Gamad and the adjacent locality of Aba, which were given as fiefs to the 7 priests together. It is also important to take note that Gamad was the final resting place of the royal saints. Shortly before the day of his martyrdom on Tekemt 4, Abriha prayed earnestly for many things, and God granted him all his requests. Among other items, God promised that Abriha's resting place, the land of Gamad, shall be the most glorious of all places. In addition, God promised that, which literally means, if anyone undertakes a pilgrimage to your holy tomb to pray on the day of your feast, I will pardon him and his descendants up to 10 generations. 38. Abriha was buried at Gamad as he wished, and his brother Asbiha continued to show a keener interest in Abriha wa Asbiha at Gamad than in any other church in the country. He is reported to have created rules and regulations for the church, confirmed Amhara as Nebraed of Abriha wa Asbiha, and instructed the clergy to keep the commemoration feast of his deceased brother. Further, he gave the land of Ad Arbea in Sarah and Sejerata in Geralta for the support of the clergy of Abriha wa Asbiha at Gamad. Towards the end, Asbiha, in turn, prayed for God to grant him his wish to be buried at Abriha wa Asbiha, and he was laid to rest with his brother following his death at the hands of a fictive pagan chief of Jimma. 39. Abriha wa Asbiha remained the special concern of Asbiha's son and successor, Asfa, who gave land to its clergy in Ambasanait and Adwad Sanad and instructed the church's officials to preserve the bones of his royal ancestors and celebrate their commemoration feast on Tekemt 4. He confirmed the lands granted to the church by the royal saints and had Bishop Salama anathematize and condemn anyone who might violate the property of Abriha wa Asbiha. Asfa made lavish gifts to the church of Abriha wa Asbiha, including 24 silver and gold crowns, 24 gold and silver censers, innumerable pieces of furniture, and scriptures. He also ensured that Abriha wa Asbiha's laws and regulations were, like the heavenly Jerusalem, and the dignity of its priests was as exalted as the priests of heaven. 40:36 The details of the miracles reported in the Gadol also speak in favor of the Abriha wa Asbiha origin of the text. The church was the setting for many miracles performed by the twin kings. A total of 12 miracles specific to Abriha wa Asbiha are reported in the Gadol as having been performed posthumously by the royal saints. 72-83. 4 are stereotypical healing miracles. One of the miracle stories is an account of the death of a godly rich person. According to the text, as soon as he was buried under the burial of the royal saints and touched their bones, the dead man revived. The person then donated property to Abriha wa Asbiha in gratitude for regaining his life. 72v-73. In another instance, a person recovered from an ailment after praying to the royal saints. Out of gratitude for his complete recovery, the person kept the commemorative feasts of the saints. 79r-79b. In still other miracle stories, we read that the saints exorcised demons from a possessed and much abused woman upon praying at the church of Abriha wa Asbiha. The woman then lived a happy, married life with children. 76v-77. In a similar case, a person came from a distant place to pray for a child and promised to donate property if his prayer was answered. The saints gave the couple a child, and the couple, in turn, visited the church on the feast of the saints and donated property. 77R 78R 37. 2 of the 12 miracle stories took place in Aksumite time. The first, which took place in the 6th century, refers to King Caleb's military campaign to South Arabia across the Red Sea. The king traveled to Abriha wa Asbiha and prayed for the royal saints to grant him victory shortly before his campaign. Caleb fought and won and instructed his successor and son Gabra Maskal to care for the relics of the saints and donate property to their shrine for the victory granted full. 79 to 79b. The second miracle pertains to King Ambasa Wedam. This king prayed at Abriha wa Asbiha church and received guidance from the royal saints to build a church at a waterless place called Wambarda. The saints then struck a solid rock and miraculously created a perennial stream for the use of the new church. One of the miracles reported is related to a special event involving the churches of Aksum and Abriha wa Asbiha. The story, which took place during the reign of King Zara Yaakub d. 1468, reports the dispute between the two churches over ecclesiastical title and rights to provisions. Abriha wa Asbiha's clergy claimed that the title of Nibara Ed was given to the head of their church by the twin kings, but the clergy of Aksum disputed the claim and argued that the title exclusively belonged to them. Further, they argued that under the ancient grant by the twin brothers and their father, the clergy of Abriha wa Asbiha were entitled to receive provision from the church of Aksum when they traveled there to attend holidays. This, too, was rejected by the clergy of Aksum as unfounded. The Gattal reports that the royal saints intervened and brought justice to the clergy of Abriha wa Asbiha. The clergy of Aksum were made to admit their mistake, repented their unjust act, and accepted all the claims of Abriha wa Asbiha's clergy full. 79 v 80 v. Another miracle story describes a fatal dispute between the church of Abriha wa Asbiha and the people of Geralta over the land of Mande. Once again the royal saints intervened in favor of their shrine, and the people of Geralta restored the property they unjustly took from the church full. 78 to 79. 38. 3 of the remaining miracles are equally interesting and point to Abriha wa Asbiha as the origin of the Gattal. One of the miracle stories refers to a poor person who borrowed money from a rich creditor for the purpose of trade full. 79 v 76 v. The debtor swore to pay back his creditor the principal and interest at the tomb of Abriha wa Asbiha. The debtor made a fortune from his trading venture but denied the debt under oath when the creditor called upon the debtor for the return of the money due to him. When the debtor was summoned to Abriha wa Asbiha over his debt, however, he immediately agreed to repay his creditor and repented his unjust act. The Gad reports that to show his gratitude for the restitution of his money, the creditor donated half of it to Abriha wa Asbiha. The last of the miracles are punishment miracles. The first of these miracles refers to the 16th century jihad wars of the Muslim leader Ahmad Gran. Inspired by the devil, a prostitute from Aksum named Gudit assisted Gran, whose army annihilated and plundered the ancient cathedral of Aksum. When Gudit arrived at Abriha wa Asbiha in Gamad with Gran's army to plunder and destroy it, angels took the relics of the royal saints to heaven and their shrine was miraculously saved. Gudit died soon after arriving at Gamad and was buried at Sarafol. 80 to 80 v. The second punishment miracle involves King Iyasu I 1682-1706. The Gattal reports that upon hearing a story of the miraculous growth of the hair of the royal saints by a visitor to the church of Abriha wa Asbiha from Gondar, Iyasu decided to go and see the miracle himself. When the king reached the tomb of the royal saints, they retaliated for his breaking of its rule. Iyasu was suddenly struck, causing him to fall into convulsions, and his Gondare informant was killed. Iyasu repented his impious act and donated a large amount of property to the church to redeem his sin full. 82 v-83. The fact that these miracle events happen only in Abriha wa Asbiha suggests that the authors may have been from the same church too, although we cannot be entirely sure. 39. While the Gattal contains many references to the property of Abriha wa Asbiha, the gifts it received from successive kings, its dispute with Aksum and the people of Geralta, and the many miracles performed there, the references to Aksum and the area around it are very limited in scope. What might be a reason for the lack of any miracles performed at Axum? Why were the 12 miracles chosen to be reported by the hagiographers? Taken together, the purpose of the miracles appears to be to emphasize the point that the Abriha wa Asbiha Church was a special concern of the royal saints and under their perpetual protection. The purpose of the healing miracles appears to be to glorify the Church of Abriha wa Asbiha and encourage people to donate property to it, whereas the punishment miracles are aimed at deterring potential competitors and violators of Abriha wa Asbiha's status, property and traditions. These punishments are perhaps indicative also of a growing concern about the Church's property. The stories of dispute between Abriha wa Asbiha and the people of Geralta and Axum could indeed have an historical basis. They probably reflect contemporary conflicts and rivalry between Abriha wa Asbiha and other churches of Tigray. It may also be the case, therefore, that the Gadol was written to serve a contemporary purpose and justify the truth and justice of Abriha wa Asbiha's claim to property and ecclesiastical office. The Church of Abriha wa Asbiha, I argue, was the place of origin of Gadla Abriha wa Asbiha. Therefore, the oldest extant text of the Gadol can circumstantially be placed at Abriha wa Asbiha. The use of the hagiography by Martula Mariam to claim right of precedency can also provide a further clue to its dating and the sources from which the writers drew upon, and thus to its social context. As mentioned above, there are 2 copies of the Gadol at Martula Mariam. The discussion below is based on the oldest extant manuscript dated to the late 19th century. In the extant text at Martula Mariam and other records at the church, there is some direct and indirect evidence that shows that the Church of Abriha wa Asbiha in Gamad was the provenance of the manuscript of the Gadol that was inspected by the royal councillors in 1897. Moreover, the Gadol at Abriha wa Asbiha was very likely the basis of the copy of the Gadol at Martula Mariam. Below I will therefore investigate the timing and circumstances in which Martula Mariam acquired the Gadol. The oldest extant manuscript of the Gadol is noted in an inventory of the manuscripts of the Church in the early 20th century, but none of the inventories of the preceding centuries list the Gadol. 41 The text of the Gadol itself does not include much paleographical information. There are only 2 later additions to the text which provide a few meager clues about the date of its copy. On the Gadol's penultimate folio is the genealogy of King Takla Haymanot Fol. 87b. Based on the genealogical material, the recension must certainly be placed after 1881, when Takla Haymanot was made king. However, the second edition suggests an earlier date of writing. 41 The second edition reads like a colophon and contains some facts about the circumstances in which Martula Mariam came to acquire the manuscript. The passage of the second edition is brief and is quoted below. Furthermore, I have quoted the colophon of the manuscript of the Gadol contained at the Church of Abriha wa Asbiha to facilitate discussion. 42 Colophon from the Gadol of Martula Mariam. This book was donated to Martula Mariam by Rosariah, who is brother to the mother of Kings Johannes. Abuna Adnatewaz, Bishop of Ethiopia, has pronounced a curse, saying, "He who steals it, deletes it, and damages it shall be cursed by the power of Paul and Peter." Bishop Adnatewaz has pronounced this curse so that it may not be removed from Martula Mariam. 42-43 Colophon from the Gadol of Abriha and Asbiha. This book belongs to Ras Gugsa, whose baptismal name is Valda Georgis, son of Zariah Selassie, son of Johannes, king of Zion, king of kings of Ethiopia. He gave it to the Church of Abriha wa Asbiha, which the kings of Axum built at Gamad, during the reign of Queen Askala Mariam, Empress Sadatu, r. 1916-1930, and during the tenure of office of Mattheus, Archbishop of Ethiopia, so that it may be a salvation for his body and soul. Glory to God for bringing us to this hour. And may the mercy and prayer of his mother, the Blessed Virgin Mary, be upon me forever and ever. Amen. Whoever steals or deletes this book, may he be cursed by the authority of Peter and Paul. Written in 1917, Year of Mercy, 1924-25. 43-44 The Abriha wa Asbiha redaction is precisely dated to 1924-25. For reasons discussed above, it is obviously based on an older extant text found most likely in the same church. The manuscript colophon from Abriha wa Asbiha represents a common genre in Ethiopian texts. Colophons conventionally mark the completion of the production of a manuscript. Usually written by scribes, colophons contain information about the date when the writing of the text of a manuscript was completed, the names of the scribe and the commissioner of the manuscript, a request for prayers and God's blessing for the scribe and commissioner, and cursing and condemnation of those who might steal the manuscript or delete its content. And in Ethiopian scribal culture, the general tendency was to write the colophon in the last folios of the texts of manuscripts and as part of the main texts. In light of Ethiopian scribal culture, the dedicatory and attribution note above from Martula Mariam is bizarre. First, the note gives no hint of possible reasons for the donation and the exact date of the copy. Second, contrary to established practice, the attribution note is written on the front flyleaf of the Gadol foal. 2v. Third, the note was written by someone different from the main scribal hand of the Gadol. Admittedly, such information can be written years after the completion of the writing of the text of a manuscript, although I do not have any known instance for this. In Martula Mariam's case, however, where the attribution note is positioned in the text and when it was written really matters. 45. The attribution note makes a number of assumptions. First, it assumes the existence of spiritual connections between Uriah and Martula Mariam. Second, the note presupposes that Adnatewaz and Uriah were together when the manuscript was produced. Third, it presupposes the existence of a firm, local, popular tradition or a cult about the mythical twin brothers at Martula Mariam already before the writing of the Gadol and Uriah's or the writer's awareness of it. There are many notable anachronisms and improbabilities in the above note. On closer inspection, one discovers that the ascription to Uriah Selassie as the source of the donation of the manuscript is spurious. To begin with, besides that suggested by the Gadol, I have found no hard evidence, even speculation, about a spiritual friendship between Uriah and Martula Mariam to account for his gift of the manuscript, thus rendering the donation note suspect. Not only is there no indication that Uriah had any link with the clergy of Martula Mariam, but also his uncle, Emperor Johannes IV R. 1870–1889, was known to have openly bad relations with churches such as Martula Mariam. Conversely, the emperor had a rapport with Martula Mariam's rival, Dima. 44. The note provides imprecise chronological information about the acquisition of the Gadol by Martula Mariam. Bishop Adnatewaz came to Ethiopia in 1869 and died in 1876. Thus, the manuscript would have been written between 1869 and 1876. But this is unlikely. In between 1869 and 1878, Ras Uriah was governor of Akalguze, a troubled region to the north of Tigray. Then he was appointed as governor of Dambia in 1878, 2 years after the death of Adnatewaz. The physical presence of Adnatewaz at Uriah's residence in Akalguze is undocumented. Adnatewaz was in Johannes's court, whose residence was at Adwa throughout the 1870s. 45. In short, the anathema pronounced by Adnatewaz and Uriah's donation of the manuscript to Martula Mariam are almost a historical impossibility. What then is the function of the reference to Adnatewaz and Uriah? It is my guess that Adnatewaz is mentioned to reinforce the authority of the message of the attribution note. Moreover, since Johannes IV had bad relations with Martula Mariam, attributing the donations to Uriah Selassie would make the Gadol credible. Whatever the nature of the link between Uriah and Martula Mariam, there is nothing whatsoever in the manuscript itself to support it. Uriah's name is mentioned in the following formulaic passage. This literally means, may their Abrihas and Asbia's prayer and blessing be with their friend Uriah Selassie, his father Demsa Malakat, his mother Tabata Muse and the writer Hala Iyasis forever. Amen. 46. Uriah appears in a similar formulaic passage of the Gadol Thol. 16v, alongside one Valda Mariam, who is identified as Uriah's Liku, a term of uncertain meaning. In yet another formulaic passages, he is mentioned alongside his spiritual father called Abisa Fol. 82v. Toward the end of the text Fol. 83. Uriah is mentioned alongside one Magabi Valda Mariam and his spiritual father Abuna Valda Mariam, and the writer of the manuscript Nemedcasis Hala Mariam. If we take all this to be genuine, then there were 2 writers of the Gadol and 2 spiritual fathers of Uriah Selassie, which is clearly erroneous. There is only one clearly recognizable handwriting, adding to doubts about the authenticity of the attribution note. As suggested earlier, a phrase like, "May their prayer and blessing be with their friend Araya Selassie," may be regarded as purely formulaic and therefore mere verbiage. Such a phrase cannot be given any weight because it could be just as easily employed when the person described was dead. This was indeed the case with Araya Selassie's parents, who surely were already dead at the time when the manuscript was allegedly copied and donated. 47. There are other compelling reasons to cast doubt on the authenticity of the donation and anathema note quoted above. If Araya in fact did hand over Thagatal in its current form to a church with which he had no recorded connection, it means that Martula Mariam's clergy had no hand in its writing. If that had been indeed the case, then we may ask who initiated Martula Mariam's origin myth. What served as a source for the story concerning Martula Mariam in the Gadol? As indicated above, no earlier text than the Gadol confirming the existence of the cult of the royal saints has been found at Martula Mariam. The records of the legal battle between Martula Mariam and its rival reviewed above show that the cult of Abriha and Asbiha was in its infancy even during the 1890s. Could Martula Mariam's foundation myth have been invented in Tigray and Ras Araya was responsible for bringing the myth to public notice at Martula Mariam? I am skeptical, however, that Martula Mariam would accept such an extraordinary myth invented elsewhere at a stroke and radically rewrite its history. Instead, I suggest that Martula Mariam was responsible for the creation of its origin myth and was involved in the composition of Gadla Abriha Wasbiha. The assertion of ancient origin, the generation of the hagiography, and the propagation of the origin myth before the final legal showdown were all part of the same project. As I will show below, either someone from Martula Mariam, or someone from Abriha wa Asbiha who knew Martula Mariam's history and was in close contact with its community, included the church's origin myth. 48. Since its mythical founders were outsiders, Martula Mariam lacked the basic background and personal information about them to write their hagiography. Because of this paucity of information to create an appropriate past, its clergy needed to convince friendly institutions in its campaign to assert seniority over Dima and recuperate the allegedly lost privileges. One such institution which Martula Mariam engaged in its effort to prepare for the court battle was Abriha wa Asbiha. The Church of Abriha wa Asbiha championed the accounts of Martula Mariam's origin myth and was perhaps an accomplice in the acts of fabrication as well. The strongest and the best evidence available to me in support of this claim is a letter written by the Church of Abriha wa Asbiha to Martula Mariam. The letter does not contain explicit chronological information, but it can be dated to the 1897 court litigation, or shortly before. Besides Menelik II's letters and verdicts, the letter is practically the only surviving source containing reference to the origin myth and the controversy on the antiquity of Martula Mariam. It thus adds another piece to our picture of the dispute between Dima and Martula Mariam and deserves to be published in its entirety. Message from the community of Abriha wa Asbiha, land of Gamad, cemetery of kings and bishops. May it reach the community of Martula Mariam, which is the head of heads of churches and high-ranking countries. How have you been? The community and the leader said, "You should wager with your lives, let alone with your cattle, in the case against those who deny the foundation of Axum and Martula Mariam by Abriha and Asbiha. Were it not for the remoteness of our dwelling, we could have stood for the case on your behalf. Otherwise, since you are diligent and persistent, we ask that you participate in a judicial wager. There is no harm, literally, never mind, and we will stand by you." It is 1,687 years since Abriha and Asbiha founded the churches of Axum, Martula Mariam, Tadbaba Mariam, Sana Kirkos, Dabra San, and in France, and for anyone to claim historical precedence over you, Martula Mariam, is tantamount to saying that Christ was not born in the flesh and did not become human. Since it is a serious matter, literally, religion, do not give up easily. May the peace of God protect you all. There will come a time for us to see each other in the flesh and meet and converse with one another. Please do not forget us in your daily prayers. As much as we can, we will not forget our brothers and fathers in our daily prayers because we are one body. 4749 The letter is currently held at the Church of Martula Mariam, inscribed in its Emester Sana Ural. What can be said, if anything, about Abriha wa Asbiha's motives for writing this strongly worded letter? The simplest explanation is that providing support for Martula Maryam's cause was the impetus behind the letter. The clergy of Abriha wa Asbiha were obviously aware of the controversy between Dima and Martula Maryam. In this letter they proceeded to add further support to the credibility of Martula Maryam's origin myth. It is worded in a way that left no room for speculations about Martula Maryam being the foundation of Abriha and Asbiha. The letter is clearly hostile to Martula Maryam's opponents, whose claim is dismissed as unreasonable and unjustified. It quite forcibly states that for anyone to deny Martula Maryam's ancient foundation amounts to denying the historical existence of Jesus Christ. The challengers to Martula Maryam's ancient origin do not even merit having their name explicitly mentioned and recorded. 50. What, then, can this letter tell us about the institutional settings in which the Gadol was written? Where was the original manuscript of the Gadol from which the Martula Maryam redaction derived? The letter reveals many important issues. First, the late 19th century Abriha wa Asbiha is the time and place to which we might trace the origins of the Gadol. The letter gives the impression that it was written as a response to some kind of appeal by Martula Maryam to Abriha wa Asbiha. The appeal perhaps involved asking them to send a copy of the old text of the Gadol to be presented as evidence during the court proceedings of 1897. It may indeed be the case as well that the Gadol in its entirety was composed at Abriha wa Asbiha at the instigation of Martula Maryam. On its own the letter does not constitute evidence that Abriha wa Asbiha first invented Martula Maryam's origin myth. The most logical deduction to draw is that the clergy of Abriha wa Asbiha were fully engaged in Martula Maryam's acts of fabrication, or, at best, complicit in such an act. 51. The letter is an especially reliable source in establishing the fact that there was contact between Abriha wa Asbiha and Martula Maryam. If there was no prior connection between the two churches, we may ask the inevitable question of why the letter was written in the first place. The circumstances and purpose of Abriha wa Asbiha's involvement in the dispute over Martula Maryam's antiquity needs further study. But suffice here to say that the possibility of the joint involvement of Abriha wa Asbiha and Martula Maryam in the composition of the Gadol cannot be completely excluded. This might have been one of the former's motives for writing the letter. In defending the credibility of Martula Maryam's origin myth, the clergy of Abriha wa Asbiha were at the same time defending the credibility of the account of the Gadol as a whole, including the part concerning Abriha wa Asbiha. There is no other way to explain the letter's existence at Martula Maryam. All this would indicate that the Gadol was not written much earlier than the court case of 1897. 52. The letter can also be linked with the crucial evidence in a brief chance note in the Gadol itself to give a context for the origins of the manuscript. In the upper part of the manuscript's 72nd folio is an insightful note which reads as follows. This literally means, the messenger who was sent from Martula Maryam to Tigray was Abba Gabra Kidden. 48. A clear resemblance can be noted between the handwriting and ink of this note and the handwriting and ink of the text of the Gadol. Thus, this note appears to have been written at the time when the composition of the Gadol was still in progress. In this note, Gabra Kidden presented himself as the messenger who was sent from Martula Maryam to Tigray. 53. What can we make of this note? The note resists historical analysis. Nothing is known from other sources about who this Gabra Kidden was. There is no obvious explanation of why this note was written. Gabra Kidden does not say which church in Tigray he was sent to and what the purpose of his trip was. The logical conclusion that one can legitimately draw from this note is that Martula Maryam was occupied with a bogus research to produce a hagiography attesting to its ancient foundation. Gabra Kidden was likely given instructions by the church to look for written material and collect oral traditions on the life of the saints Abriha and Asbiha. Gadla Abriha Waspahakold have been the result of his journey to Tigray. Although Gabra Kidden's physical presence in the church cannot be proved, it is very likely that he was sent to Abriha wa Asbiha at Gamad. The passage concerning Martula Maryam in the Gadol may well have been based on information he supplied. At the very least, the note about Gabra Kidden requires us to discard as invalid the idea that Rasaraya donated the manuscript and Martula Maryam had no active involvement in the acquisition of the Gadol. Two aspects of the Gadol point to Martula Mariam's contribution to its composition: the ways that the story of the church are told and the information the Gadol left out of the account. The Gadol comprises several pieces of information specific to Martula Mariam. The honorific title bestowed on the head of the church by Abriha and Asbiha, the manner of building and the splendor of the church's architecture, and the many monks and clerics settled by the twin kings are given. Significantly, the Gadol's writers include details about the rich gold and silver ornaments that adorned the building of the church. These details about the physical magnificence and organization of the church were part of the old official stories Martula Mariam told about itself before its clergy perverted its actual history later in the 19th century. 49. It is worth noting that no such details are given for other churches believed to have been built by Abriha and Asbiha in places outside of Tigray. Such curious details about the church could not be written by someone without intimate knowledge of the place and its history. We are therefore justified in arguing that Martula Mariam had a hand in the Gadol's composition. 55. Finally, the Gadol is written exclusively on Martula Mariam's terms and along lines that would help its case for precedency. The writers of the Gadol carefully filtered out any unfavorable information that might compromise Martula Mariam's claim of ancient heritage. Naturally, the Church of Dima is omitted from the account of the history of Christianity in the Gadol. In other places within Gojam where the twin kings briefly stayed, the construction of churches is barely implied in passing. For instance, the churches at Dabra Zait, Mount Olive, Nazareth, and Karanyo Calvary, Golgotha, are not featured directly in the narrative. Instead, these sites are mentioned only as the setting for multiple visions. They are described as having been named by the twin kings after holy sites in Palestine. 50. The choice to include these places in the account of the Gadol seems arbitrary, without any apparent deep meaning. The most plausible explanation appears to be that these places are mentioned because of their biblical-sounding names. The hagiographers never returned to Martula Mariam after its foundation. A good explanation for this distinct lack of interest in the church's later history is that such information was thought to lack ongoing significance and was therefore irrelevant. The alternative explanation for this neglect is that it was intended to avoid detection of fabrication. It is clear therefore that the writers made deliberate choices about the information they included in the Gadol. The evidence presented makes implausible the suggestion that the Gadol was written without the involvement of the clergy of Martula Mariam. 56. I would conclude this analysis by suggesting that the Martula Mariam recension of Gadla Abriha Wasbiha was produced for the hearing of the legal dispute in the court presided over by Menelik in 1897, or shortly before. Once again, the late 19th century Abriha wa Asbiha is the time and place to which we might trace the origins of the Gadol. The Gadol was fabricated by the clergy of Abriha wa Asbiha, and the story of Martula Mariam's ancient origin was inserted into the Gadol at the urging of Martula Mariam. The allegedly ancient manuscript that was consulted by the Judicial Assembly and pronounced genuine could not have existed before the late 19th century. The circumstances of the growth of Martula Mariam's origin myth are unrecoverable from surviving texts available to me. All we can state with certainty, then, is that the myth resulted from the need to assert seniority over rival institutions. Conclusion 57. The two epistles written from Emperor Menelik II to King Takla Haymanot were part court judgments, part records of dispute settlement, and part letters, and they served a variety of purposes. The letters and verdicts must be viewed as legal texts in the first instance. Similar to all legal texts, these letters and verdicts were written so as to put into effect the terms of the dispute settlement between the churches of Dima Georgis and Martula Mariam as well as the rights and privileges that the Judicial Assembly authorized. Their preservation had an ongoing administrative purpose because they served in and of themselves as legal proof of the validity of the status and privileges of the two churches enshrined in them. Like all legal texts, their validity was expected to outlast the lifespans of the individuals involved at the time of their creation. They are also legal verdicts because they narrate the actions and judgments of a judicial assembly and the means by which the judgment was reached. This study has also established that the narrative in hagiographic writings had legal and administrative functions. The evidence presented in this study shows that the clergy of Martula Mariam saw hagiographic writing as a tool that they could deliberately shape to achieve pragmatic goals. They deployed the hagiography of Abriha and Asbiha to help their church realize what they saw as their privileges and rights and to disguise their actual history. Thus, hagiographic writing should be studied not only for its literary and historical data, but also for its legal and administrative functions.